Dad, just sign it. Please, don't make this harder than it has to be. Those words still ring in my ears. 63 years of life, and I had never felt so cornered. My hands trembled over a thin sheet of paper, as if the weight of 4 decades could be poured into a single signature. The house on Maple Street was quiet that evening. Too quiet. A leaky faucet dripped in the kitchen, steady as a ticking clock. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal, reminders of the garage where I had spent most of my working life. On the table lay my bank statement, $180,000, my entire safety net. Margaret sat across from me, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee mug. She didn't say much, just glanced at me now and then. Christopher stood, restless, pacing like a man with everything to gain and nothing to lose. This was no longer a simple conversation. It felt like the opening scene of a family drama I never agreed to star in. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. Dad, he pressed, leaning in. This isn't just money. It's an investment in the future. My future. Our family's future. I kept staring at the numbers on the page, as if they might rearrange themselves into an answer. 40 years of grease under my nails, of missed vacations, of saving $1 after another. Could I really hand it all away in a single moment? 40 years, I muttered under my breath. Can I really hand it all away? Christopher's eyes flashed with urgency. Margaret shifted in her chair, silent. The walls seemed to close in. My pen hovered, hesitating. Then, with one final breath, I signed. Christopher's smile was quick, almost too quick, like a flame catching. For a second, it looked less like gratitude and more like deceit wrapped in charm. And as I slid the paper across the table, a question burned in me. Did I just hand over my life, or secure my son's future? The dining table smelled faintly of varnish and old dinners, a battlefield polished but scarred. A chipped salt shaker leaned against a pepper mill, as if even the condiments understood balance was hard to keep. Christopher had spread papers across the table, rough sketches of logos, lists of projected earnings, names of imagined clients. At the top, in bold black letters, Collins Tech Solutions. He tapped the page with his pen, the rhythm quick, impatient. This is it, he said, his voice sharp with certainty. A real company. We'll handle IT contracts, security systems, maybe even government work down the line. Detroit needs new energy, and we're the ones to bring it. I watched his hands more than his face. Hands that once held toy cars and baseball gloves now traced numbers with the hunger of a gambler. His plan glittered with ambition, but glitter always hides the cracks beneath. All of it? My voice came low, gravel caught in the throat. You'll really need all of it? Christopher didn't blink. Dad, this is our chance. Trust me, I'll triple it. Across from us, Margaret lifted her fork, then set it back down without taking a bite. Her eyes stayed on her plate, as if silence were her only safe answer. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, like a judge already resigned to the verdict. The numbers haunted me. $180,000 gone from my savings, the last net beneath a man who had climbed too long without a rope. Now my son wanted it all for a promise built on paper and ink. I glanced at the family photo on the wall. We were smiling then. Christopher in his high school jacket, Margaret leaning against me, myself holding a wrench still greasy from work. That picture had the warmth of truth. This table, tonight, carried the shadow of deceit. Is trust the same as blind faith? I asked, though no one seemed to hear it but me. The papers on the table fluttered under the weak hum of the ceiling fan, like wings eager to fly, though the nest was already trembling. The house on Maple Street had never felt so large. The silence between its walls stretched like a canyon. After the money was gone, after the signatures were dry, the phone barely rang anymore. Christopher's voice, once filling the kitchen with stories and noise, came only in short, clipped phrases. Busy now, Dad. Later. Later never came. I sat in the kitchen, the table buried under envelopes. Electric, water, gas, each stamped in red with deadlines creeping closer. 40 years of rising before dawn, of hands cracked from work, and yet here I was, measuring how much light and heat a man could afford. The refrigerator hummed like a weary animal. The faucet dripped, steady and cold. And on the wall, the old clock ticked, its pendulum swinging like a cruel metronome, counting down patience, counting down pride. Every second mocked me. Time was no longer a friend. It was a judge. I dialed Christopher again, thumb pressing harder than it needed to. He picked up, voice distracted, laughter faint in the background. "Dad," I said later. Then the line cut, leaving nothing but static and my own breath heavy in my ear. I leaned back in the chair, wood groaning under the weight of a man who once thought he was strong enough to carry everyone. My eyes fell to the drawer where I kept the bank book. I pulled it out. Pages that once held balance and security now lay empty, as blank as promises unkept. Was this the cost of love, or the tax of blind hope? The clock ticked again, louder now, as if mocking the fool who thought money could buy loyalty. And still, I stared at the hollow savings, a ledger that had once been my life, now nothing more than paper and regret. The call came just after 6. The evening light slanted through the blinds, stripes of gold and shadow crossing the kitchen wall. My old friend Mark Reynolds didn't waste time with greetings. His voice was sharp, almost disbelieving. "Ed, I just saw Christopher on Main Street, driving a brand new Mustang. Red, at least 70 grand. The words landed like a hammer. I gripped the receiver tighter, knuckles whitening. For a moment, the room spun. The refrigerator hummed on. The clock ticked above my head, but everything else went quiet. "That can't be," I finally managed, my voice a rough whisper. "He said it was for the company. Collins Tech Solutions. That's what he promised." Mark exhaled, a sound heavy with pity. "Ed, open your eyes. A man doesn't buy a car like that if he's struggling to launch a business." I hung up, but the echo of his words lingered in the air, like smoke refusing to clear. Through the window, I caught a flicker of red in the distance. My heart clenched. There it was, shiny, polished, the kind of car I used to admire in magazines when I was young. Now it cut across the intersection, its chrome wheels catching the dying sun. A stallion unleashed, carrying not freedom, but deceit. Christopher's laughter floated faintly as he passed, drowned quickly by the roar of the engine. The car's reflection bounced off storefront windows, glowing like fire in the twilight. It was a spectacle meant for strangers, not for a father who had emptied his life into his son's hands. I stood at the window long after the car disappeared, hands pressed against the sill, breathing shallow. Was this what I had worked for? Did I just fund his dream or his vanity? The clock ticked behind me, each second daring me to face the truth. If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee gone cold. Margaret was wiping the counter, her motions slow, deliberate, as if polishing the silence itself. I had rehearsed the question in my head a dozen times since Mark's call, but when it finally came out, it scraped my throat raw. "Did you know?" She froze, cloth in hand, but didn't look at me. The pause was answer enough. Still, she spoke, her voice almost too calm. "He's our son, Edward. Maybe he needs to look successful first. Appearances matter when you're starting out." "Appearances?" I nearly laughed, the kind of bitter laugh that hurts your chest. "With $70,000 under his hood? With my entire life savings?" Her eyes flickered at the words "my entire life savings." She leaned on the counter, shoulders sagging. "It's not just about money. It's about giving him a chance." "A chance to what? To show off to strangers on Main Street while I sit here calculating if we can keep the lights on next month?" The air between us thickened. I could hear the refrigerator humming, louder than usual, like it was trying to fill the silence neither of us wanted to break. For a second, I imagined it mocking me. 40 years of work, reduced to humming appliances and overdue bills, while my son revved his engine for the city to admire. Margaret finally turned to me, eyes wet but defiant. "You're too harsh. He's young. Don't you remember what it was like to want more than what you had? I remember, I said, voice shaking. And I also remember earning it. The cloth slipped from her hand, falling soundlessly to the floor. For a moment, neither of us bent to pick it up. The marriage felt like that cloth. Dropped, ignored, waiting for someone to stoop low enough to claim it again. Was this what betrayal looked like? Not daggers in the dark, but soft words, reasonable excuses spoken while the floorboards of trust cracked beneath us. The evening light slanted through the blinds, cutting the living room into sharp bars of gold and shadow. I had asked Christopher to come over, and he arrived without the warmth of a son visiting home. No hug, no small talk, just the faint smell of expensive cologne and the glint of a new watch on his wrist. I gestured toward the worn sofa. He sat but leaned forward, restless, as if he had somewhere more important to be. My hands shook slightly as I held the folder of bank receipts, the proof of where the money had gone. "Chris," I began, voice steady though my chest tightened. "I gave you everything, every dollar I saved for 40 years. Tell me the truth. What have you done with it?" His eyes darted toward the window, then back to me. For a brief second, I thought I saw shame flicker, but it vanished, replaced by something harder, colder. "Dad, stop!" His tone was flat, almost rehearsed. Then the knife came, hidden in the plainest of words. "You're just a burden now." The sentence hit me like steel to the ribs. I froze, unable to breathe, as though the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, but she said nothing. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. I sank down onto the edge of the chair, the folder slipping from my grasp, papers scattering across the rug like fallen leaves. My hands trembled, betraying the weight of a truth no father should carry. How could a lifetime of sacrifice be reduced to that one word, burden? And was this the end of love, or just the mask that money had forced onto my son's face? The kitchen was cloaked in half-darkness, the single bulb above the sink flickering like it too was undecided whether to stay or give up. A stack of bills sat on the table, leaning like a crooked tower. Electric, gas, insurance, all demanding attention with bold red stamps. Edward sat there, his elbows pressed into the wood, his eyes unfocused. The silence pressed down heavier than the weight of the paper. He thought of 40 years gone. The alarm clock at 4:30 every morning. The heavy boots laced before dawn. The long shifts at the plant, grease staining his hands, overtime hours traded for a few extra dollars to put aside. He remembered how each paycheck was split. Rent, food, and a little tucked into the savings account. Over decades, that little grew. Not into luxury, but into security. The dream that maybe his son would never have to grind his bones the way he had. Now the account was empty, his trust hollowed out like a carcass. He whispered to the blinking light, as if the room might answer. Was it all for this humiliation? His voice cracked, fragile and bitter, like glass about to shatter. Margaret entered quietly, her shadow stretching long across the floor. She lingered in the doorway, arms folded, eyes lowered. She said nothing. No words of comfort, no hand on his shoulder, just silence, which felt louder than any accusation. Edward looked at her, hoping, almost begging with his eyes for one sign of shared grief. But her face was unreadable, as though even she was hiding behind a mask of endurance. The kitchen became a stage for unspoken truths, the kind that rotted a house from the inside. It was then he realized this wasn't just about money. This was the anatomy of a family drama, laid bare in flickering light and unpaid bills. Trust cracked, love strained, and still time moved on, ticking in mockery from the clock on the wall. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting uneven patterns on the peeling wallpaper. I was hunched over the mail again, bills and flyers mingling in careless stacks, when a knock rattled the door. Mr. Jenkins, my neighbor of nearly 20 years, stood there, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket, eyes squinting against the glare. "Ed," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "People talk. They say Chris has been throwing parties at that new loft downtown." I felt my chest tighten, a bitter cocktail of disbelief and anger rising. "Parties? With my money?" My voice wavered, more fragile than I wanted. Jenkins nodded, his expression a mix of pity and amusement, the kind that made you laugh and cry at the same time. "Yeah, the Riverfront District. Monthly rent's over $2,500. Looks like he's living the high life." I sank onto the worn chair by the window, the threadbare fabric scratching against my palms. The laughter and music drifting in my imagination felt like a cruel parody, mocking every long night I had spent tightening the belt, clocking overtime, building a nest egg so that my son could start out right. I pressed my lips together, tasting the metallic tang of betrayal, wondering if my faith in him had been naive or willfully blind. It felt like a deceit not shouted in courtrooms or letters, but whispered over city rooftops, carried by people who didn't know the cost behind the figures. Margaret passed by in the hallway, quiet, her gaze flicking briefly at the table. No words, only a sigh that seemed heavier than the afternoon heat. I stared at the mailbox again, imagining the party lights reflecting off the glass windows of that loft, imagining the champagne and laughter. And I realized that the distance wasn't just physical. It was the widening gap between a father who had given everything and a son who might not even notice the hands that fed him. If this story stayed with you for a moment, support us by liking and subscribing. Every click helps us tell the next one. The living room felt colder than usual, though the heater hummed in the corner. Shadows stretched across the carpet, long and uneven, as if the room itself were reluctant to witness what was about to unfold. I turned to Margaret, finally gathering the courage to ask the question that had gnawed at me for weeks. "Edward," she began hesitantly. "Chris, he gave me some money. I didn't want to tell you." Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the quiet. I stared at her, my mind stumbling over the words, trying to process the betrayal. "You too?" The syllables tasted like ash, sharp and bitter. My hands clenched the edge of the armchair, nails pressing into the worn fabric. Margaret avoided my eyes, twisting her wedding ring in nervous loops. I didn't ask for it, but he insisted. He said it was to help with the bills, to keep things comfortable. I thought I could protect you. Protect us." Her voice faltered, unraveling in the weight of her confession. I felt the room spin slightly, as though the air itself had turned traitorous. 40 years of trust, sacrifice, and quiet endurance seemed suddenly hollow. Not only had my son squandered the life savings I had painstakingly built, but now the one person I had leaned on, my partner through every hardship, had been a silent participant. The walls seemed to close in, filled with the unspoken words that now shouted louder than any argument. "A son who betrays, a wife who hides. How do you measure loyalty when money writes its own story?" I whispered to myself, the words tasting like regret. Margaret finally spoke again, her tone fragile. "I thought I was helping. I thought it would make things easier." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping despite the ache in my chest. "Easier?" I muttered. "It's never easy when trust is borrowed and spent." The air between us was taut, like a string stretched beyond its limit, vibrating with tension and silent accusation. The quiet carried a strange resonance, a family drama built on unspoken deals and broken promises. In that moment, the truth was a heavy presence, impossible to ignore, and I realized that I was facing not just Christopher's deception, but a fracture that ran deeper, all the way into the heart of my own home. The morning air in Detroit was sharp, carrying a promise of frost on Maple Street. Edward tightened the collar of his coat as he walked to the small office of Linda Hayes, a lawyer he had known for years, someone who had once helped neighbors settle disputes over far less than 40 years of a lifetime's savings. The brass nameplate on the door gleamed in the weak sunlight, reflecting a world that felt suddenly colder, more calculated. Inside, Linda greeted him with a measured nod, her office lined with thick binders and framed degrees that seemed to whisper authority. Edward placed a trembling hand on the edge of her desk, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers, a stark contrast to the roughness of his own hands, hardened by decades of work in the garage. "We need to start gathering everything," she said, pulling a stack of bank statements toward him. "Account transfers, invoices, receipts. The Mustang, the downtown loft, every expense he's claimed for the company." Edward leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking beneath him. His eyes lingered on a small clock on the wall, the seconds marching forward relentlessly. "It all feels so surreal. 40 years of work, all entrusted to him. And now it's about proving what? That trust can be twisted into deceit?" His voice cracked, but there was a spark there, a flicker of determination that hadn't been present the night of betrayal. Linda scribbled notes quickly, her pen scratching against paper like distant thunder. "Mr. Collins, you still have a chance. But you'll need courage. Not just for the courtroom, but to face the truths you've been avoiding." Edward swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those truths settle in his chest. "I've got nothing left but courage," he whispered. It was almost laughable, he thought, how courage could feel both like a lifeline and a chain. The edges of the office seemed to bend inward, the walls listening, waiting for the next move in what had become a family drama more tangled than he could have imagined. As they organized the documents, Edward noticed a faint reflection in the window. A ghostly silhouette of Christopher, not there physically, but in every memory, in every invoice, in every lie that had crept between them. Each sheet of paper felt like a breadcrumb trail through a forest of deception, and he was determined to follow it to the very end. He left the office with a folder tucked under his arm, the brisk wind hitting him like a challenge. This was more than money now. It was accountability, a confrontation with a son who had blurred the lines between ambition and entitlement. And perhaps, he thought, it was a test of his own endurance, a measure of how much a man could bear before breaking, or fighting back. The morning mail brought more than letters and advertisements. It carried the weight of inevitability. Edward held the official envelope in his hands, the thick paper crisp against his fingertips. Christopher's name printed in bold at the top made his stomach twist. A court summons. Not a suggestion, not a negotiation. An inescapable summons to confront the man he had once called his son. The house on Maple Street seemed quieter than usual. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint drip from the kitchen faucet, even the old floorboards creaking under his steps felt exaggerated, mocking in their normalcy. Edward set the envelope on the dining table beside a cup of half-cold coffee and stared at it. It was as if the paper itself carried a pulse, reminding him of all the months of tension, the quiet betrayals, and the unseen toll of family drama that had settled like dust in every corner of his life. Then the phone rang, breaking the silence. Robert Miller, Christopher's lawyer, spoke with a polished calm that grated against Edward's nerves. "Mr. Collins, perhaps we can settle this quietly. Avoid the courtroom. No need for public scrutiny." Edward's fingers tightened around the receiver, knuckles white. "No," he said, voice steady but cold. "I want the truth in daylight, not behind closed doors. Let everyone see what has happened." There was a pause, almost theatrical, like the faint sigh of someone realizing they had underestimated the determination of a man scorned. "You'll regret this," Miller warned, a hint of forced levity in his tone. Edward hung up and leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath that felt heavier than air should allow. He looked out the window toward the street, the winter sun glinting off the frost on car roofs, mocking in its brightness. Justice, he thought, had a funny way of feeling both impossible and inevitable at the same time. He gathered the folder of bank statements and receipts, stacking them neatly, each page a small monument to trust misplaced. This was no longer about the money alone. It was about accountability, exposure, and perhaps the bitter satisfaction of forcing honesty out of a man who had perfected the art of evasion. Edward paused for a moment, listening to the wind tug at the edges of the blinds, and allowed himself a bitter, half-amused smile. If Christopher thought he could run, he had miscalculated the quiet patience of a lifetime. Evening settled over the Maple Street house like a heavy quilt. The kitchen light flickered as Edward shuffled through papers on the counter, the faint smell of burnt toast lingering in the air. The house felt smaller tonight, every shadow sharper, every creak of the floorboards amplified. Emily, his bright-eyed granddaughter, appeared in the doorway, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit. "Grandpa, why are Mom and Dad fighting with you?" Her voice was soft, curious, tinged with worry. Edward swallowed hard, the lump in his throat catching him off guard. He wanted to answer, to explain the betrayal, the deceit, the painful truth of his son's misused trust. But words failed him. He only managed a tight-lipped smile, letting the silence stretch like an invisible wall between them. He glanced at the family photo above the mantel. The frame was cracked at the corner, the glass reflecting the kitchen light like a distorted memory. In the image, Christopher's younger self grinned with innocence, Margaret beside him, and Edward standing proud, a lifetime of hard work etched in his posture. Now, the cracks in the wood seemed to echo the fractures in their family, each one a silent testimony to broken promises and hidden resentments. Margaret's voice drifted from the living room, low and unreadable, as she argued in a tone that balanced civility with an unmistakable edge. Edward could feel the tension seeping into the walls, threading through every corner of the home, a constant reminder that family drama was never subtle. It lingered, it grew, and it demanded attention. He caught Emily's gaze again, innocent but searching. And for a moment, the weight of betrayal pressed even harder. How do you shield the next generation when the foundation has cracked beneath you? How do you teach trust when it has been weaponized against you? The wind rattled the window panes, whispering through the gaps, and Edward felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the quiet, relentless truth that this was only the beginning. If this journey stirred your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It's the fuel that lets us keep creating more. The polished floors of Wayne County Courthouse gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, echoing every footstep like a countdown. Edward's hands were clenched on the wooden bench, the smooth surface cold against his skin, while the weight of anticipation pressed on his shoulders. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, mingling with the anxious hum of whispered conversations. Across the room, Christopher sat with his lawyer, Robert Miller, shoulders relaxed in a posture that suggested confidence or arrogance. Edward's stomach twisted as he remembered the Mustang, cherry red, gleaming in the sunlight, a glaring reminder of money meant for dreams, now spent on vanity. Susan Carter, a bank officer, was called to testify. She adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and spoke with precise calm. On March 14th, $180,000 was transferred from Edward Collins' account to Christopher Collins' personal account. All documentation verified. Edward's chest tightened. Each word landed like a hammer, reverberating with betrayal. He caught Christopher's smirk and felt the familiar sting, an echo of every sleepless night and every unanswered phone call. The judge's gavel tapped once, twice, bringing a hush over the courtroom. "Proceed," Judge Thompson commanded. Edward leaned forward, trying to steady his voice. This wasn't just money. It was trust, and it was misused. His eyes swept the room, lingering on the red Mustang parked in memory behind his eyes, an emblem of deceit flashing like a warning light. Christopher's lawyer interjected, his tone slick and rehearsed. "Your Honor, my client maintains that the funds were spent responsibly, in line with business ambitions." Edward's hands trembled slightly, gripping the edge of the bench. He wanted to shout, to shake the very air around his son. Instead, he inhaled slowly, letting the courtroom's tension anchor him. This was the first step, the opening of a chapter that had been written in silence, secrecy, and now undeniable confrontation. Every eye in the room felt like it pierced straight through him. Yet beneath the surface, Edward sensed the deceit threading through the air. Delicate, but undeniable, a quiet storm ready to erupt. The walls seemed to close in, and the gavel's next tap would begin the reckoning. The courtroom felt heavier today, as if the air itself had absorbed the tension from the previous day. Sunlight cut through the blinds in sharp lines, landing on the piles of documents stacked neatly on the evidence table. Edward watched each sheet like a revelation. The Mustang purchase invoice, the Riverfront District loft lease for $10,500 a month, party receipts with champagne and gourmet catering. Every number was a silent accusation, a trail leading back to the son he had trusted. Christopher shifted in his seat, his usual charm cracking under scrutiny. His voice rose, brittle and sharp. "So what if I spent it? I deserved it." The words reverberated through the room, bouncing off the marble walls and cold wood panels. Edward felt a pang of both anger and disbelief, as if the room itself had joined in the condemnation. A hush fell. Even Robert Miller seemed caught off guard, adjusting his tie nervously. The judge's gavel struck once, twice, a metallic punctuation that demanded silence. "Order!" Judge Thompson's voice was firm, unyielding, a reminder that decorum still reigned despite the emotional chaos. Edward's eyes narrowed on Christopher, trying to pierce through the bravado. How could someone callously turn years of sacrifice into a justification for indulgence? The luxury car, the loft, the endless parties, all spent under the guise of ambition. Yet the truth smelled of entitlement and family drama, bitter and unavoidable. He remembered Margaret's quiet nods, her silence earlier now an echo of complicity, a shadow that stretched across the room. The walls seemed to close in, the evidence stacked higher, and Edward felt that the final confrontation wasn't just a battle of numbers, it was a reckoning of hearts. Every flash of the red Mustang in his mind, every glint of the loft windows felt like a taunt. The courtroom had transformed into a theater of truths laid bare, of illusions crumbling. Edward held his breath, knowing that the next testimony might shatter the thin veil Christopher still clung to. The courtroom was silent, heavy with anticipation. Edward sat rigidly, hands clasped over his knees, listening as Judge Thompson cleared his throat. The gavel struck once, then twice, echoing like a heartbeat through the marble chamber. "Christopher Collins must return the remaining funds to his father. A legally binding promissory note will be filed immediately." A shiver ran through Edward, a strange mix of relief and emptiness. Justice had been served, but the price felt far higher than dollars and cents. Margaret's shoulders sagged, her head bowed low, tears tracing silent lines down her cheeks. The quiet sobs were almost drowned out by the shuffle of papers, the murmurs of the courtroom staff, the ticking of the old clock mounted on the wall. Edward rose slowly, each movement deliberate, like carrying the weight of a lifetime. He glanced at Christopher, who stared back with a fleeting expression. Anger? Disbelief? Maybe even shame? But none of it could erase the years of betrayal etched into Edward's memory. Winning felt hollow. The house at Maple Street, the small dinners, the decades of saving, it had all led to this courtroom, and yet the family he thought he knew was fractured beyond repair. Outside the window, the Detroit sun glinted off the glass buildings downtown, harsh and unyielding, reflecting a world that had changed too fast. Edward realized that the victory on paper could never fully heal the erosion of trust, nor erase the lessons that money had exposed, that love and loyalty are rarely measured in dollars. The gavel struck again, final this time, and Edward exhaled, a slow, quiet surrender. He had won. And yet he had lost something far more intimate, something a bank balance could never restore. Chapter 16. Cold wind on Maple Street. Edward stepped out of the courthouse, the Detroit wind slicing through the streets, tugging at his worn coat. It smelled of rain, asphalt, and the faint tang of exhaust. a familiar symphony of a city that never truly slowed down. He pulled the collar tighter, feeling the weight of the past 40 years press against his shoulders. The sky hung low, a slate-gray canvas, echoing the turmoil in his chest. He thought of the money, the lawsuits, the Mustang red as cherry candy under the sun. Could wealth ever truly secure love? Or did it only reveal the fissures that had been there all along? The answer hovered like smoke in the cold air, intangible yet undeniable. Across the street, the Mustang sat gleaming. Its polished windows reflected Edward's face, lined, tired, but still steadfast. There was something almost ironically comical in the reflection, a dark humor in the fact that a car could mirror both his son's ambition and his own vulnerability. He realized life had a cruel way of delivering lessons dressed as victories. A message buzzed on his phone. It was Emily. Just a simple text. "Dinner tonight? I miss you, Grandpa." Edward felt a warmth he hadn't noticed in weeks, a quiet reminder that not all connections were lost. Perhaps trust, fractured though it might be, could still find its way through smaller, gentler gestures. He breathed deeply, watching the clouds drift over the city skyline. Money had been the stage, but love, true, patient, enduring love, was the story he would carry forward. He tucked his hands into his pockets and whispered to himself, "Family isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in moments, choices, and the courage to keep showing up." The wind tugged at his coat again, carrying with it the echoes of laughter, arguments, and forgiveness. He stepped onto Maple Street, each footfall a quiet testament to resilience. Somewhere between the shadows of the courthouse and the glow of the streetlights, Edward understood. Endings were rarely absolute. They were openings, too. An invitation to rebuild, to forgive, and to witness new beginnings. He glanced once more at the Mustang, then up at the gray sky, and smiled faintly. Life was messy. Trust was fragile. But even in deceit and heartbreak, there was room for hope. A future, uncertain yet bright, awaited. If you liked this story, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about it in the comments. Thank you for watching. Wishing you health and happiness with your loved ones. Stay tuned for the next compelling video. You won't want to miss it.